Hi, and welcome to Chapter 9. This is a chapter that ties in actually to the previous chapter pretty well. So the previous chapter we just covered, Chapter 8, you will remember is about management, human resources, and labor relations. So remember what HR is about, human resources, and training employees a big part of it, managing, etc. And so this chapter is dedicated to motivating employees. I always like to ask you to think about your work and imagine maybe a current job or a previous job that you've had, and your boss comes up to you and asks you this: would you be willing to volunteer 3 hours, 4 hours a week because the company's struggling and they need some help? And then just think about how you would answer the question. Don't tie it right now to your own financial health. Assume that you're okay and you can afford it. So the question is, if you had the choice and you could afford it with that specific job that you have in mind, current or previous, would you do it? Would you do it? Or would you not do it? And what I've experienced in the classroom when I ask that question is on either side, people will really feel strongly about it. I will have students who will tell me yes, they would because they love their boss and their boss has gone out of their way for them. Maybe some emergency, something happened and the boss was great, really just looking out for the employees. And they love their job. They don't want to let their boss down, etc. On the flip side, often I will hear students say, absolutely not. My boss is a jerk. I don't like going there. I get anxious. They don't try to cooperate with my schedule. They're very coercive, and therefore I wouldn't work an extra second over there. And so all that to say how important motivation is, right? I also sometimes use the example of sports, right? If you have done any sports, whether in team sport, in high school or college, and you think about these amazing coaches that you've had, right? And think about how motivated you were when you worked out and at meets or events. Or reversely, you had a very lousy coach and you just didn't feel motivated at all. So motivating employees is critical, and it's smart leaders. That's another thing we'll learn later on when we start doing more on management, the chapter on management, and we'll look at the difference between a manager and a leader, and that's when you will see it's very clear that there's a leader is very different than a manager, right? A leader inspires. That's the key operative word right there. A leader inspires others to perform. A manager just tells you what to do. All right, so let's look at what we'll be covering here today. So this is going to be broken down in several sections, right? So we're going to look at some of the old timers here. For those of you who have already taken management, you recognize those names: Frederick Taylor, Scientific Management, Hawthorne Experiment or Hawthorne Studies with Elton Mayo. I'm sure you've all come across Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's covered in psychology and sociology. We use it in business, in marketing. It's going to show up again. By the time you're done with college, you'll have heard of this many times. McGregor's theory, X and Y, Ochi's theory, Z. This is great because he's not always featured in every book, so I'm glad that he is here. Let's see, we'll look at Hertzberg. So, by the way, these are the classics, right? And then we'll kick into the more current Hertzberg the motivator hygiene theory. And then we'll look at the 4 contemporary theories for employee motivation. We're looking at insight into how we improve employee performance. And then how can managers redesign existing jobs? So this is job design or job redesign to increase employee motivation and performance. Lastly, what initiatives are companies taking today to motivate and retain employees? Let's get started. So here are the early theories of motivation. So first, let's look at the definition. Very basic here. We're going to look at motivation as a set of forces that prompt a person to release energy in a certain direction. So anything that you feel that you are motivated to achieve, accomplish, that would be a definition. I like to argue that your education. I know that most of you are highly motivated with your classes and with your work and with studying and learning, because you understand that, of course, once you get your bachelor's degree, it'll open more doors. More importantly, the knowledge that will come with it is what's going to help you secure that great career. So a need is the gap between what is and what is required. Again, you're motivated to get that degree because you need the education to get the job, right? A want is the gap between what is and what is desired. So in this case, there's a difference between a need and a want. Those two, by the way, are going to show up again in marketing, right? Think about consumers, and needs and wants are a very, very big deal. You need transportation. You should just buy a used Camry, but you know what you want is a BMW. So anyway, you get the idea. Unsatisfied needs and wants create a state of tension that motivates individuals to proactive behavior that will result in the need being met or the want being fulfilled. You have different types of rewards that come with motivation from the individuals, right? So one is the intrinsic reward, the other is the extrinsic reward. The intrinsic reward is the one that matters. That's the one that gets people to keep their jobs for 30 years. That's the one that gets people to show up to work, be excited, and be highly productive. And that's just the satisfaction and the contentment of the work itself, right? The extrinsic reward is more superficial. It's not the one that's going to get you to keep people, or at least get them motivated to be highly effective in their performance. So a pay raise, a promotion. Not to say that it's not great, but in terms of long-lasting, think about, you probably know someone in your life who has left a great paying job for a lesser paying job because they were miserable, right? And again, the idea here is that no matter how great the extrinsic reward is, if you don't love your job, if you're not getting the intrinsic reward, might not last. All right, let's look at the models of motivation here. The model of motivation. So again, the money, pay, bonus. That's the extrinsic factor. When you learn more about quality, and Dr. W.E. Deming, he very famously used to say that pay is not a motivator. And I remember the first time I heard that as a college student, I thought that was crazy. But the way that he explains it and the way you really dive into it, you understand what he meant by that. Again, the intrinsic motivator is how you feel about your job. Think about a doctor, right? So a doctor might have the intrinsic motivator. They feel good about helping people being healthy, and or maybe finding some complex disease that a patient had and that they were able to identify, right? They, of course, have the extrinsic motivator that they get paid well. Think about someone who's an EMT. Many of my students have gone into that program, and I know that often I hear them say the intrinsic motivator is what keeps them. Literally saving lives. I mean, what could be better than that as a job? But in terms of extrinsic motivator, most of my students have complained that the pay's not great, the hours, there's a lot of things that come with being an EMT that's not satisfactory when it comes to the extrinsic motivator, but the intrinsic motivator, at least with the performance of the job itself, is what keeps them going. So again, that tension leads to effort, and the effort leads to satisfaction. And the gap between where you are and where you want to be is what's keeping you motivated to get to your goal. All right, let's get into the early theories of motivation. So we'll look again at the father of scientific management, Frederick Taylor, Hawthorne's studies with Elton Mayo, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Douglas McGregor, Uchi, and Hertzberg. These are the early theories of motivation. And once we're done with those, we'll go into the more current. So let me kind of give you a visual on the next one here. Let's say that I'm going to have a group of you do a little experiment. And for 1 month, every day, Monday through Friday, every day of the week, at 7:30 a.m., you will be dispatched to go to Starbucks. And each of you at 7:30 a.m. will go in and order the exact same drink. You will, once you enter, document how many people are waiting in line in front of you. You will document how many people are waiting behind the counter. And more importantly, you'll time everything. Average timeline of wait, depending on average people waiting in front of you, total time that it took to make the coffee, total time that it took to order, etc. So you will do this, let's say a whole class of about 45 students, you will all do this Monday through Friday, 5 days a week for a whole month. And then after that, you will do the exact same thing, but you're not going to Starbucks. You're going to pick small businesses, mom and pop shops, and you're going to replicate the study. Oh, by the way, you're not going to drink those coffees. Let's say it's some complicated something. What you're going to do is you're going to send those coffees to a lab, and they will be tested for consistency. And we're going to do the same thing with mom and pop. You will go to the same mom and pop. Each student picks one and they all go to the same. And we'll test the same thing. And then the question becomes, who is going to be more efficient, right? Who is going to get your coffee the fastest? Who has a better system? And more importantly, which coffee is going to be more consistent in terms of how it tastes, right? And of course, you will find that when you get the results from the lab and you tabulate everything, that scientific management is going to show you that Starbucks is going to win. Now, why is that? Well, that's because Starbucks spends millions of dollars every year on improving efficiencies, scientific management, right? And consistency leads to quality. Variation or any deviation from consistency is going to lead to defects. You want the thing to be the same. All right, so that's kind of the essence of scientific management here with Frederick Taylor. He is the father of scientific management. This is what's referred to as the classical era. He worked for Bethlehem Steel, and his approach was to improve performance based on economic incentives and the idea that there's one best way to perform any job. There's so much written about his work. He was a really interesting guy. He himself was a worker and he became a manager. In the management class, you will learn a lot more about him. He's a very interesting guy. He published a book called The Principles of Scientific Management, which number one was to develop a scientific approach for each element of a person's job, then scientifically select the individual, train them, and develop workers. This might not even sound like such a big deal, but you're talking about an era described as quote-unquote seat-of-the-pants management, where people were hired based on nepotism or just because I just need a warm body to do this thing for a couple of months. And so he really was way ahead of his time there. He encouraged cooperation between worker and managers so that each job can be accomplished in a standard, scientifically determined ways. Think about the example I just gave you of Starbucks. And divide work and responsibility between managers and workers according to who is better suited for each task. Again, there was a science behind the selection for employees. So that's a very important guy. By the way, scientific management, yes, Frederick Taylor is the father, but this book, because it's intro to business. We're going to just not go into as much depth as you will in management, where you learn about Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who are very involved in a big part of scientific management as well. So I'm just throwing that out, but I just don't want you to think that's where the story ends. Let's now go to Elton Mayo. So Elton Mayo is a Harvard professor who was hired to continue this Hawthorne studies. And the Hawthorne studies was a very, very big deal. If you think about Elton Mayo and the Hawthorne experiment or the Hawthorne studies, the impetus of the study was basically an efficiency study. If I go back here to Frederick Taylor, he's obsessed with efficiency, isn't he? And then when I get into here, now notice this is the human relations era. So we're talking about classical era with scientific management, Frederick Taylor. But then with Elton Mayo, he really creates what's known as the human relations era. And so he comes in and has this light experiment, just as it sounds, where he's going to pull out a team of workers, and he's going to subject them to different lighting environments to see if more light, same light, less light is going to affect output. Now, think about naturally what you think about this experiment. Do you think more light, less light, same light might affect outcome? Because what ends up coming out of this thing is fascinating. And he discovers that the group that is being observed for the experiment is more productive, no matter what the conditions are with the lighting, than the other employees who are not part of the experiment. And so this is known as the Hawthorne effect, right? Employees perform better when they feel singled out for special attention or feel that management's concerned about employee welfare. It might sound like a very logical thing to you, but again, this is an era where management tells people what to do, and that was it. So this was revolutionary. It provided evidence that informal work groups have a positive effect on group productivity as well. So that's again, human relations era, Elton Mayo with the Hawthorne studies. Now let's get into somebody you're all familiar with. Here he is, Abraham Maslow. And so Maslow on page, by the way, 340. So Maslow here, you guys all know, the reason it's called the hierarchy of needs is because according to Maslow, you can't get to second level or third level if you haven't completed the previous levels, right? So your first level is the physiological need, right? Food, shelter, clothing, etc. And so he basically says that it's a physiological need that motivates someone to find a job in the first place. You need that stuff. So that's why everybody works. Everybody's working just to meet that basic need here, right? And then as we go forward to the second, a need right there, safety need, right? So think about that as a shelter, etc. Moving along to the third level with the social need, it's the need for belonging, acceptance by others, and for giving and receiving friendship and love, right? The informal social groups, and respect for the others, etc., are part of esteem needs, right? Let's see, the need is reflected in feelings of self-worth, right? And the final need here is self-actualization at the highest level. It's a need for fulfillment, for living up to one's potential, and for using one's ability to the utmost. And so, by the way, there's criticism, of course. People have skipped steps. I know probably the most famous example used to really question that there is a need hierarchy that must be met is Anne Frank, right? With her journals, she was self-actualizing, but really didn't have any of the lower needs. All right, so that's for Abraham Maslow. And if you apply it to business, it makes sense. If you think about, yes, I have a job, that's great. So I'm able to meet my physiological and maybe even my safety needs, some of them. But what if you don't give me dental, vision, and my kids I have a kid who got cavities, and it's going to cost me $1,200, and I don't have $1,200, and you don't pay me that great, but it's a job. But so what you're seeing here is that you can't ask that employee to go to the retreat where everybody shares knowledge and information and we all go rah rah, we're such a great team, when you have not helped that employee meet one of the lower level needs with just dental, right? So just think about how that works. All right, now let's go and move on to Douglas McGregor, right? And so Douglas McGregor is another interesting guy. He was a student of Maslow, and he came up with these theories X and Y. Theory X, if I remember well, was modeled after the military, and these are views, right? So when you're thinking about X and Y, you're thinking about a paradigm that a manager has of his or her employees. It's the view that a manager has of their employees. So the theory X manager views employees as disliking work and avoiding work whenever possible. The theory X manager believes that employees must be controlled, directed, or coerced with punishment. He or she believes that employees prefer to be directed and they will avoid responsibility, they don't have ambition, and all they want is job security. Think back of Maslow on that one, lower level need. On the other hand, the theory Y manager believes, and this is probably the most important statement right here, work is as natural as play or rest. Work is as natural as play or rest. How many of you know someone who just couldn't retire? They were miserable. And so especially in our culture in the United States, that's a very important part of the culture. In this case, employees can be motivated with positive incentives. Employees seek responsibilities, and the employees have a high degree of imagination and creativity, and you should really tap into that. Obviously, in 2020, successful companies, your author gives us a lot of examples here that the Fortune's list of 100 best companies to work for, one of the things they all have in common, of course, is theory Y management style, to say the least. And then we have theory Z. Now, it's interesting because, yes, they sound like they should kind of belong together, but they're not together, right? So this is Douglas McGregor. And then after this, we go to Professor Ochi of UCLA, who created Theory Z. So Theory Z is fascinating. Theory Z is fascinating. It's a culmination, really, of the American business way. So almost think about like a Theory Y type American leadership with a Japanese management leadership style, right? So differences in management approach, the length of employment. Traditional U.S. management, it's usually short-term. People, workers are subject to layoff. It's if business is bad, and people move on, right? They change companies every 5 seconds and just keep climbing that way. By the way, this is outdated. Just so you know, the younger generation in Japan is not exclusively following this model. But culturally, Japan has a lifetime, Japanese management has a lifetime employment. Layoffs are never used to reduce cost, right? In fact, I have a friend who used to work in Japan and shared with me that what he observed was if an employee started with a company and left another company, right? So you have this new employee that works for you, and maybe they work somewhere else for 6 years. There is a group of employees in your company who will never truly trust that person. They betrayed their previous employer. They left, right? And so that is it's still present in the culture, not to the extent that it was when Dr. Ochi wrote this book on Theory Z back in the 80s. And so in terms of theory Z, it's the combination of the both, long-term but not necessarily lifetime layoffs. Is still inappropriate. A stable, loyal workforce, improved business condition don't require new hiring and training. I think about Southwest Airline, and even during recessionary times, this is a company that's been exemplary in resisting the urge to lay off people. And so, that's why they have one of the strongest employee loyalty. They say one of the hardest things to do at Southwest Airline is to get a promotion because no one ever quits. So the rate of evaluation and promotion, relatively rapid in the US, slow in Japan. And here with Z, slow by design. Managers thoroughly trained and evaluated, right? Specialization in a functional area. It's considerable in the US. Worker requires expertise in single functional area. It's minimal in Japan. They require expertise in organization instead of functional area. And so Z does moderate. All experience various functions in the organization and have a sense of what's good for the firm rather than a single area. So a little bit more crossover here. Decision making is individual in the US, input from all concerns in Japan, and here you're seeing more and more group decision making in the US. Responsibility for success or failure assigned to the individual in the US, shared by group in Japan. Here with Z, still with the individual. There are some things that just are really hard. By the way, again, since this was written in the 80s, there has been improvement, and a lot of companies now are assigning more responsibility on a group-based format. Control manager is explicit in the US and very formal, more implicit and informal in Japan. And with Z, you had relatively informal but with explicit performance measures. Concern for workers. Here, the focus is on work-related aspect of worker's life, and here extends to the whole life of worker. And with Z, it's relatively concerned with workers' whole life, including the family. You've heard, people say, keep your personal life to yourself, etc. And more research is showing that that's just not realistic. If you're miserable or you're going through a tough time at home, of course it's going to affect work. And so it does make sense for the company to be a resource to help you with things that they might be able to help you outside the company. All right, so Hertzberg. Now we're getting into Hertzberg's motivation hygiene theory. He researched, the question was, what do people really want from their work experience, right? And he came up with two things, the motivating factors and the hygiene factors, motivating and hygiene. It's not what happens at the end of the long day working out in the yard, you might think, I'm motivated to take care of my hygiene. It's not really quite like that. In this case, motivating factor are the job satisfiers, the intrinsic job element that lead to satisfaction. So what do we have here? Achievement, recognition, the work itself, responsibility, etc., right? On the other hand, the hygiene factors are really interesting. Here's what you need to know. It's not the opposite of a job satisfier. It's called a job dissatisfier, but it's not a demotivator in itself, right? Let me explain. So if you have, in this case, those hygiene factors, and let's look at what they are. Extrinsic element of the work environment, they're called job dissatisfiers. Might be a little bit misleading because I want you to think it's not just the opposite of the job satisfiers. Hygiene factors, company policy, supervision, working condition, salary and benefit, job security. So here's the deal. Here, with the motivating factors, these characteristics might make you really want to go to work. This is the one where you might tell your friends, your family, your loved ones about why you love working there, right? People love working at Zappos. People love working at Google. There's all kinds of reasons. Those best top 100 companies to work for, Smuckers, all that. And so those are the motivated factors. Nobody is going to be whistling on their way to work because they have healthcare, because of company policy or salary. I mean, unless they just get a pay raise, right? In fact, Deming did a lot of work on that with, again, when I was telling you about pay not being the best motivator. And if you want to put this in terms of a very, very simple formula, if I double the salary, will you double output? Think of it that way. You can, if I jack up your salary by 20%, are you going to jack up output by 20%? And so as a hygiene factor, it's important, but as a motivator, not quite. All right. So that I hope I explained it in an effective manner. Now, we're done with the classics, so let's look at the contemporary views of motivation. We're going to have 4. We're going to look at expectancy, equity, which kind of ties in together, goal-setting theory, and reinforcement theory. So what we have here is how expectations can lead to motivation. And so we have, for this, according to expectancy theory, the probability of someone acting in a particular way depends on the strength of that person's belief that the act will have a particular outcome and on whether that individual values the outcome. I just want you to think about, again, work and going the extra mile and, maybe taking on an extra project or something. And if you're doing it, it might not be entirely altruistic. You're not just doing because you're just such a great guy or a great gal. You're doing it because you expect something. You hope that maybe this will lead to a step increase, a pay increase, something, right? And so you're putting effort into it because you have some level of expectation that your performance will lead to an outcome that will meet your individual needs, right? So there's expectancy here at each level, between effort to performance, between performance to outcome, and between outcome and individual needs. Now, let's talk about that and apply it to equity theory. So now what we have is kind of the same thing we just talked about, except we're going to make it inequitable so that you can see how that feels. So equity theory is based on someone's perception about how fairly they are treated compared to their workers. So employees evaluate their own outcome, your salary, your benefit, in relations to their input, how many hours they're working, what level of education they had to go through or training, etc. And then they compare the outcome to input ratio to one of the followings. So the first thing is they'll go like, okay, what about your own past experience in a different position in the current organization? When I worked in this previous department or when I worked in this other department here at this company XYZ, when I did the thing that I just did here, I got a better increase, or I ended up having this other great thing that I wanted, a bonus, and now I don't. Or it could be that the previous company you worked for had a different outcome, right? And so that's going to affect you. That's, by the way, why people leave, obviously. Or maybe another employee, you have a colleague who's at the same level as you, same years, you guys were hired the same month, and you have everything's the same degree, and in this case, they're getting paid more than you, right? Or someone outside the company with exactly the same level that gets paid more than you, right? You hired somebody new. You've been there for 20 years and you have worked really, really hard to build the profession that you have. And that new person comes in and they just complain about meetings. They complain about work. They don't show up to meetings. Their performance evaluations, when you look at customers and you're trying to get assessments, customers are not happy. They don't understand. They're not getting the service they were expecting, or it's not effective. They're not being delivered what they're buying. And so in this case, keeping that employee would not even be equitable to you, right? Because maybe they're getting paid the same thing you got paid when you first started, but in this case, you're picking up their slack. So that would be inequitable. Just think about what happens when you find that happening to you, right? What does that mean if you are working for a company and any of these things happen. So again, we're on page 348 right now. And so what happens is if you perceive that the inequity exists, you're going to make some choices. You could change your work habit. You're going to work less. Like, you know what? This other employee over here is not working as hard. Why am I working so hard? I'm going to work less. Maybe change job benefits and income. You ask for a raise, or you're just going to, you know what? I'm going to start stealing. I mean, people do that. They have to make it up to me, and here's why. So, I don't know. Distort their perception of themselves. Maybe it affects you on an emotional level. I always thought I was smart, but now I realize I'm not smarter. Maybe it distorts your perception of others. Wow, Joe's position is much less flexible than mine. Maybe you look at the situation from a different perspective. I don't make as much as the others, but I make more than most graphic artists or whatever. Or you quit, right? Either way, this is why management matters. And this is why smart management matters. It matters because it can poison an organization. I am sure you have your own examples. But once someone sees the inequity, number one, they're going to look for another job. But think about what kind of employee they are, not just as an employee, but how they affect morale. You know, what are they going to tell the others during their lunch hour? And once people realize, like, wow, this is true, this is, nepotism. Early 1900s, when you learn this in the management class, but when you look at Max Weber, that was one of the tenets of his many rules on bureaucracy when he created bureaucracy, was to get rid of nepotism. And so when, people hire their friends, their family, or, something like that, it affects morale, and you lose good people. All right, so let's continue where we're on equity. Let's just go straight to goal setting theory. So goal setting theory here on page 349 is based on the premise that someone's intention to work toward a goal is a primary source of motivation. That's the theory, right? They're working because they have the goal and they're working toward that goal. Once set, the goal clarifies what needs to be done and how much effort is required for completion. And this is where you can invoke SMART goals if you want. All right, so for goal setting theory. And then we get into reinforcement theory. Behavior is a function of its consequence. I'm sure if you have any pets, you're very familiar with the 3 types of consequence for how to train your dog. I don't know. I don't have a cat, so I don't know how trainable they are. But positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, or no reinforcement, either positive or negative. I think it's extinction, right, in psychology. And so all of these are ways to help with consequences to, maybe reinforce a behavior, right? And that's why somebody gets a bonus maybe in the company, because you want to give positive reinforcement to the employee that did the most whatever something. By the way, we'll talk about quotas later on when we talk about operations. I'll talk about quotas and how quotas actually can be very toxic. We'll talk about that. And they can be artificial, and they can have pretty gross unintended consequences, right? Because people just focus on the quota and make the numbers even sometimes artificially. All right, so now we're getting into the motivational job design. And so just think about a really mundane type of situation. Think about fast food job, right? Maybe you've had a really, really boring job, a very low skill, low wage job. You worked in some factory or something. I know many of you work, I've heard students working in warehouses for different of the warehouses that we have here in the Inland Empire. And so nobody's really kind of, again, like whistling on their way to work on that one, right? It's a job, you got to pay the bills, end of story. And so there are ways of trying to make that job better. right? If you want to call it that. And so the first one is called job enlargement. And one of them is obviously here horizontal expansion, and the other one is vertical. So job enlargement is a horizontal expansion of a job, increasing the number and variety of tasks that are performed for the job. Unfortunately, sometimes that'll happen not because the company is just trying to motivate people, but it'll happen because of layoffs. So you had a coworker got laid off, and good news, you got to keep your job. Bad news, you're doing their job and your job. And so that can also be looked at in a different light. And so the job enrichment is the vertical expansion of the job. And so whereas job enlargement addresses the breadth or scope, here you're looking at the depth by providing the employee with more autonomy, responsibility, that's for job enrichment. Yes, responsibility and decision making. So the employee can use a variety of talents and skills. There's lots of examples given. I know that you guys are probably all familiar, of course, with Nordstrom. And Nordstrom has very, very few rules. Like their main rule is use common sense. I mean, that's like one of their number one rules, just use common sense. And so that would be job enrichment, right? You're really trusting your employees. Job rotation, also known as cross-training, is the shifting of workers from one job to another. I was lucky enough to visit the BMW factory in Munich, Germany, several years back. And it was fascinating. I mean, the whole tour took several hours. I can't remember. I think we walked like 6 miles from beginning to end. But what was interesting is that when they were, when we're touring the facilities, then all of a sudden you would see some workers leave their station, and we thought they were done with their shifts. And what was happening is they were going to another station, and that would help with injury, with fatigue. And so now instead of only working on the transmission, I'm going to the brake area and putting the brakes and the rotors on the car. And what it does is I'm using different muscle groups. I'm using my brain differently. It changes the monotony of me, working on the transmission 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, or 5 days a week. And so the cross-training is good in many, many ways. Again, like I said, it reduces injury, makes the day go faster, but also it helps with quality, because now I understand the interaction from one station to another, and I can start to connect the dots better and come up with recommending things that will help with the entire process. We call that optimizing the system. All right, the work scheduling options. So there's many ways of looking at that. So flex time, is one. You let your employees come up with their own schedule. Basically, it sounds like anarchy. It might sound crazy, like, oh my God, that's never going to work. My employees are going to take advantage of that. Well, a lot of studies have shown that if you give your employees a choice, like I'm going to give you your schedule, or you can pick your own schedule, there is so much incentive for students to control their schedule that for workers to control their schedule, that between all of them, they will want to make it work. And so you might find out that you have less problems with absenteeism, because again, people don't want to mess it up. And so people will cover each other. They'll have favors that, remember I covered for you here, can you cover for me there? And they'll come through because they know if they don't, then the alternative is nobody has any control. The compressed work week, which by the way can tie into the 4-day work week. Let's talk about the 4-day work week. Why 5-day work week? Why does it have to be that way, right? 40 hours. What if I did 10 hours a day, 4 days a week? Can I be as productive? And in some environments, as long as I'm not dealing perhaps with a retail environment where I have to see clientele 5 days a week or something, it can make your employees extremely productive, because they again have this incentive to want to have 3 days off. How great is that? They don't want to mess it up. And you will find that you might even get more out of your 4-day work week employees than a regular 5-day, 40-hour work week. Telecommuting, well, that's what we're all doing now with of course, with the pandemic. Most of us are doing that, I should say, not all. And job sharing. So job sharing happens when two people are sharing one job. So it's not really two people sharing, two full-time jobs. Of course, recognition and empowerment is a big deal. Millennials, there's all kinds of studies showing that maybe the baby boomers didn't rely as heavily on recognition for work. They just worked and that was it. But each age cohort is showing that recognition is definitely more critical to get to perform. And so more and more companies are realizing that you have to tailor your system so that you are giving people feedback routinely and according to their performance. Empowerment, we talked about that earlier. Smart companies empower their employees and let them, basically have trust, right? Think about you're returning something at a store and the cashier kind of has a disincentive to take your return if it's a big deal. They have to call the manager. They have to wait for the manager. There's people behind you waiting in line. Everybody's upset. The manager shows up and then they have to use the magic key and open the cash register. And, it's such a big deal. How much money did you just lose? How many people waiting in line are just not going to wait anymore because it's a stupid waste of time? Again, going back to Nordstrom, if you trust your employees and you empower them and let them decide how they want to do the returns and let them empower them, they don't want to mess it up. They'll do it right. The example from your author here on page 354 is Netflix. I love the Netflix policy. Netflix hires, quote, fully formed adults and tells them to use their best judgment to act in the company's best interest. Again, you'll recognize that from Nordstrom. Of course, the economic incentives, we talked about that. When you take management, you'll learn more about that. I'm not going to really go over it here. I'm not going to ask you, to memorize all of them. Piece rate, plan option, profit sharing, gain sharing, stock options. Stock options once upon a time were a thing. Sam Walton, very famously, one of the ways that he grew Walmart to what it is today was by giving employees back then a stock option. But now government tax incentives have affected how much equity companies offer each year, indicating that stock options are declining in popularity. Same thing with bonus. All right, folks. Well, we did it. This was less than an hour. We're at 47 minutes here. So I'll leave it at that. Have a great week and stay ahead. Remember that next week we will start on chapter 10. We're past the halfway point, obviously. Achieving world-class operations management. Really fascinating chapter. I can't wait to cover it with you guys because this is when we're getting into work that will apply to many of you. I know many of you are working in distribution, logistics, warehousing, and operations management is a big deal with that. There's going to be content. For those of you who already took management, there'll be review, so that's great. See you guys next time.